What's up, everyone?
So great to be here. We did it.
I'm Jake. I'm a developer advocate here at Figma. And Tom is with me tonight, or this afternoon. And we didn't plan on this until about 2 minutes ago.
So originally, Emil was supposed to present, but he was feeling a little bit unwell. So wish him well. He did our keynote yesterday. He did great. I don't know if anyone saw the the ninja cursor move where he managed to get the prototyping viewer behind the notification that was on the screen the whole time. So really, really slick. But I'm happy to fill in for him on short notice. So if I'm a little rough, please forgive me.
We do this all the time.
OK, so when we talk to a lot of our customers, one of the things that we hear about, especially for companies that are growing really quickly, is that it can be really difficult to maintain the product quality, especially when you have multiple products or multiple brands. You've got different teams that are working on different products. And when we talk to teams, one of the most common ways of trying to solve that problem is getting everybody aligned on common patterns. That way, if you have everybody pulling from the same patterns, you don't have a lot of duplicative workflows and people building the same things across the org. And that kind of leads us to design systems. And so design systems are an amazing solution to this. But design systems really only solve the problem if everyone's actually using them.
Yep.
So to date, in Figma, obviously, lots of you have, I'm sure, published libraries, and you're enabling them for your entire org. But the same adoption challenges also exist on the development side.
Yep.
And in the development side of things, if you have different teams that are building, in this case, a button, you can end up in a scenario where you've got very similar patterns that are being built, and they differ a little bit. And this is one of those things that results in not only just visual inconsistency and a decrease in product quality, but you also end up with multiple pieces of code that exist in different parts of your code base that you have to maintain. So one of the interesting places that I would say that Figma sits in is we're trying to strike this balance between free-form design. So this is the way I think of it is you drag something on the canvas, you absolutely position it. You're not really worried about the exact relationships between two elements. And that's really helpful conversation starter for you to get buy-in, present ideas, get feedback from people. But at one point, we want to help you transition to more of that structured design. Think of things like auto layout, frames, spacing, padding. This is where design systems are really helpful because you might be using spacing and padding variables and bringing a little bit more structure to your design. But then at one point, we need to make this leap of how do we align with what's in code?
Right.
And designers and developers do things a little bit differently. Jake will talk about what that looks like in a little bit. But also, from a developer point of view, you get a situation where you're going into your code base to write code. You're seeing a component that's in Figma. You have to go cross-reference it with a component that's in the docs. You have to make sure that the props are the same. They might be named differently. And then you spend a lot of time toggling between different tools just to get a code snippet that hopefully matches what you have in Figma. So we think design systems should be the path of least resistance to get to that state. And Jake is going to tell you a little bit more about what that looks like.
So this is why we built Code Connect. Code Connect is going to bring that code from your design system into dev mode. So as you click around and you inspect your designs in dev mode, you're going to see the code for how to implement that design. And the default CSS code that we see oftentimes is really helpful when we're building out those components. But we encapsulate that in a pattern, and whether we're using CSS class names to capture that or wrapping it in a React component. At that point, that's not really the sort of code that we end up looking for. And so let's take a quick look at how Code Connect works using the new iOS and material design kits we released yesterday. That was a really big deal. We could select the button component from the iOS or material design kits to show Code Connect for Swift UI and Jetpack Compose, respectively. This is production code that you can simply copy and paste into your project, which ensure your code matches the design in Figma and makes use of the built-in design libraries that we're surfacing. So we launched Code Connect in beta 9 weeks ago, and the feedback has been amazing from the community. Not only has Code Connect already helped many of you drive better efficiency and design system adoption within your companies, this feedback's also enabled us to vastly improve the stabilities, the capabilities of the platforms that you want to have supported with Code Connect. And with these improvements, we removed that beta label yesterday as we feel confident that Code Connect's ready for everyone. Speaking of adopting Code Connect, I'm super grateful to have been able to work with Gilson and the rest of Gilson's team over at HP. They were one of these first teams that we used to help us learn what they need, and they really adopted Code Connect in a way that, even though we were early in testing and things like that, it really helped them out. So it's been great to see it have that huge impact so soon while we were in beta. And of course, it's not just large companies that benefit from Code Connect. We just saw this tweet from Lowry the other day. So how does it work? In short, Code Connect starts with a code file in your code base, and that is often associated with your design system. In these files, you're going to use the native language of your choice, so React, Swift UI, Jetpack Compose, to describe how the design patterns are going to correlate and correspond to the patterns in your code components. And finally, you publish these connections from your code base to Figma, and now that sits in Figma as metadata on that component, so it can render that design system's code for you. Now, while design systems share a lot of patterns across Figma and your code base, there can still be a lot left to translate. As a developer, I think there's two major themes that I think we needed to get over with this feature. The first being kind of what I'm calling the space hyphen between us. These are the discrepancies that kind of always exist, and I personally believe as a developer, they are not necessarily bad things. If you think about it, there are really good reasons why we deviate between how we think about patterns in design and how we think about patterns in code. These discrepancies are looking ahead at this, designers are looking ahead at the idea of what we want, right? All of you out there who are designers, you know the vision, you're evolving the product, you have this picture for where we want to get. And developers are very much in tune with the idea of what we have. And that friction that happens is that what we want and what we have kind of coming into conflict at times, but teams that do this particularly well are able to have that communication, that bi-directional kind of unification when they come and they think about this stuff. But if you think about it, we're coming from very different points. And so our orientation towards what we're building, we're going to optimize those paths and those trajectories a little bit differently. A designer experience is not the same thing as a developer experience. And so even though we're talking about the same patterns, how we get there and how we kind of optimize those implementations are going to always have some room where there's a little bit of gap. The second thing, Figma natively surfaces really good code, if you think about it, today. But this is the code that describes how the components are built, right? This is describing the shape, the colors. Even when you're using a design system, it's going to pull in your variables and those sorts of things. But that type of code is not necessarily describing the same thing as using a component. I like to think of it as a toolbox. If your design system's a toolbox, your components are the tools that go inside of that toolbox. Now, we all might share a lot of similar ideas when we think about hammers and screwdrivers and those sorts of things. But this code kind of describes how those tools are built. But once they're built, the task is different. We're looking for what is the tool that I need to grab out of the toolbox to use that component. And what are the instructions for how to use it? And if you think about it, while we share a lot of these same patterns, some of us have that weird hammer with the ball on both ends, and some of us have a big one with the hook. And so the instructions can change based on how we build these tools. And so the only way for Figma to be able to recommend something to you that is actually relevant when it comes to how to use the tools is to allow you to tell us what to show. And that's essentially what Code Connect is. So enough blabbering. We're going to go do a demo here. I have always be hydrating for you live stream watchers. Unfortunately, I don't have any water to actually hydrate. All right, brilliant. So we're going to switch over here to our code base. Wonderful. Now, Tom, you've seen this sort of a thing before, have you?
Of course.
Yeah, so this is the button component that we made. Louis and I worked on Simple Design System, which is essentially a design system UI kit that exists in Figma. And in addition to Code Connect, we also have a working React app and Storybook instance, as well as a bunch of scripts to help your teams get started. So this is the button from that Simple Design System. Now, when we look at a button like this, we're going to just plop open the component playground because it's an amazing way to kind of learn a bit more about these little components. So we have a button, we have a variant, we have three kind of color variants. We have a primary, a neutral, and a subtle. We also have states, which in design world, if you're an engineer looking at this, you're like, what are you talking about? But if you're in the design world, you understand that we have to describe how the focus visible is going to look, and we have to describe how the hover state's going to look. And so we use variants to do that on the design side. So those are also component properties in Figma. And then we also have the sizes. We have a medium and we have a small. We have the label, which is what we're calling this stuff here. Hello, Emil. Emil is in the hotel right now getting some rest, but I know he's watching. Thinking of you, bud. And now we also have these Boolean properties. So if you're a developer, Tom, if you're a developer, you're going to be like, why do you have multiple properties for an icon? And there's really good reasons for that. Designers love the ergonomics of being able to design systems designer puts this component together, gives it to their design team. Their design team, the way that they're thinking when they implement these sorts of components, it's nice to have Boolean behavior inside of Figma. So this is essentially toggling what you could think of as a slot property if you're a developer. But it allows us to drop any other icon inside of here, and that's visibility is behind that Boolean toggle. But enough of this. When we scroll down here, we're going to look at, let me grab an instance. We're going to look at some CSS. And check it out. We're using a design system. So we've mapped some web code syntax to these variables that we're using as padding and as a gap property, or as a gap, CSS property, as well as kind of some size things for our border radius, our border, our colors. Now, this is really helpful when we're building the button, but the button's been built. The tool's in the toolbox. So we need to have different code here. And that's where Code Connect comes in. So if you want to look at it, we're going to copy link to selection here. So we select the main component, because we're only going to write one doc for this entire thing. We're going to copy a link directly to that component, and everyone hold their breath. We're going to the code base. Now, here we have a very simple React button component. This is the part that spits out some HTML. But this is the TypeScript that's talking about the props as they exist in code. Now, we can see we have a lot of similar things here. But we're actually going to just put that away for a second. And in the console, we're going to run npx Figma connect create. And we're going to paste the URL that we just copied from Figma. Now, what it's doing is it's going out and it's getting everything about that component in Figma. It's processing all the information about the properties that are there. And it's going to spit out a button.figma.tsx file, which I'll hide this for a second. So what this has done, this is the team sitting over there, love y'all, DevTools. What they've done is they've written this thing that goes out to Figma, gets all the information about the component it can, and creates its best guess with what it knows for mapping these properties to code. So we can see all these same properties. We're converting, this plain language string name of these layers into, or name of these properties into kind of some code camel case. And we also see that all four of these icon properties are present right here. This is all the stuff that we've gotten from Figma. Now, we're going to do a little thing called spread the props. Can everyone say that with me? Spread the props. We're going to spread the props. And what this does is it takes all of these props right up here. This is a little code thing that we're doing. It takes all of that and it spits it out onto this button component. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to come back here and we're going to run npx Figma connect publish. Now, I've been doing a lot of talking, but really we've run one command, we've spread the props, and then we just ran this one command. And what we're going to see now in Figma when we click on an instance is React. Except if you're a developer, you're going to be like, It's good. We can get a round of applause. But if you're a developer, you're like, that's not the right stuff. And that goes to show you that just because it is React code, it is reflective of what this component is. It isn't exactly what we're looking for. So let's now go. This is how simple it is. I mean, it took us 30 seconds, if I wasn't talking so much, to actually get this connection between Figma and the code base. If we click this link, it's going to go to our component file on GitHub. Really magical. Now, we want to go in and we want to clean this up. Do you know that?
I know that.
OK. I was making sure, because
I will
we have
say,
not rehearsed
as a
this at all.
non-developer, I had to set this up the other night at about 12 a.m. and it was about half an hour of like reading the docs and getting it set up. And so I feel like if I can do it.
If Tom can do it, no, actually, give yourself more credit. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to clean up these Boolean properties. Like I alluded to earlier, our developers are like, you just have one property. You don't need two properties. So we're going to cut that Boolean property right here, and we're going to paste it here. And we're going to say, hey, when that Boolean property is true, then render that instant swap, otherwise undefined, and then we'll close that out. VS Code is all up in my stuff right now. So what we've done is we've said that Boolean property called hasIconStart, we only care about it when it's true. And in the case where it's true, we're going to grab the code for the icon instance swap called iconStart. And that's what iconStart camel case is going to represent. Now, instead of doing that one more time and boring everyone to death, we are going to actually just paste, and we're going to Command D. Did you know about this? This is multi-edit for coders. And we're just going to write the word end. Now, we've cleaned up our two sets of icons. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to grab this string property. So this is the text property called label. And we are going to destructure the props.
I did not know about that.
OK. Now, the reason we're doing this is because what we want to show is we want to put the label right here like this. So this is what we call children in React. React children, you put them as a child component, and you'll see when it renders out. So that's the first thing we're going to do there. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to delete the default options, because developers don't need to write the default options all the time. So when it's the default option, we're just going to ignore it in the code output. And last but not least, state. Kind of thought about this a little bit earlier. We alluded to it. You create these state variants, Tom, and we don't really think of it that way. So like hover, focus, disabled. These things are actually, in the web world, written in CSS. They're encapsulated in the DNA of the component. So we don't actually need to like pass in some of this stuff as a prop. But there is one state we care about. Do you know what state that is?
The disabled one.
We do care about the disabled state, Tom. So we're going to put the disabled right here. And we are going to ignore default. We're going to ignore hover. And then instead of rendering a string, we're going to say true. So we're converting a variant in Figma to a Boolean in code. All right. We're just going to publish. And we're going to, hopefully, there we go. And now we have fully documented the SCS button. And you know, without the talking, this would hardly have taken any time at all. So here we can see icon start is there, but it doesn't say has icon start. It's just either there or it isn't. We see that the variant's there because it's not the default variant. But if we go ahead and we select maybe this primary, variant doesn't even need to be present. One last thing while we're in here. See how that's a red underline? That's how we know that this is not good yet. So I can hover over this. Because we're in the code base, this is going to give us all the benefits of being in the code base and using the real stuff. So it's telling us you're missing an on-click event, so you might want to add that. And turns out that's probably going to be really important for our developers to see inside of Figma. So I'm just going to give them a little stubbed out on-click handler. And check it out. Red line went away. Great. So let's put that back here so that we see something a little bit more realistic. The timing on that point was perfect. And we've got it. Last but not least, disabled. Check it out. That's a Boolean now. So it's only showing up when the state is disabled. Here's a hover. And notice how hover isn't present there because that's just in the DNA. All right. So you might be saying, well, that's great, but that's your design system. You got to set it up the way that you wanted. Now, Anyone out there heard of Material UI, MUI? It's an amazing resource that a lot of developers use. They build their design systems on. For a lot of folks, it's a baseline accessibility layer that really gets them into a place that's a lot better than they were at. Material UI has a button component that has 300 variants, right? And we can see that right here. I've copied this over from the Figma community. So we have, they've got contained with a ton of color options. They have outlined, I believe is, yeah. So this is just Material UI's button component. And in just about the same amount of code, we're able to actually document this directly. So I've written a Code Connect doc that actually imports directly from the material library. So if you want to kind of document other people's stuff, you can, like this. Now, one little nuance of Material, which you may or may, you definitely don't know, is that their loading button is actually coming from a separate repository. So they have a separate, we can see here, we've got a separate little MUI lab that we're bringing out the loading button from. And we have the ability to document a different variant with a different component in code. So let's take a quick little peek at how that's working. So if we come over here to I can officially hide that. If we look at the Material UI button here, we're bringing in the button, and boy, does this look familiar, right? This is pretty much the same thing that we were just doing for all of our SDS button. But then down here, we have another little redundant Code Connect doc. And what that's doing is that's doing the exact same thing. This URL to the button in Figma is the same. But we have a new line that says, only apply this when the variant state has a value of loading. And so that allows us to render a completely different component inside of Figma when a different variant is selected. Now, enough about MUI. We also want to take a peek down here. Actually, really quick before we go, here's an alert, right? We have the ability to pass in different components as instances here. But let's talk about something a little bit more complex, because I feel like that's where it starts to get hairy. Because developers build components that get used in a bunch of different ways, and single components can also have different documentation based on context. And so that's something that we can also document with Code Connect. So to start for this example, we have like a navigation component. So this navigation component has essentially two lists instances, or two list components in Figma, but then also two different types of items. So we have a pill item and a button item. Now, we can look at how this is documented here. We have a navigation button. We're passing in an icon, star icon, as an icon property, and then the children as a label. But when we look at these two different components in Figma, we'll actually see that we're going to render them both very similarly. So the first thing you'll notice is that this looks a little bit different. We're rendering actually some example code that is talking about an array of items, which is often how a component like this is often implemented, where you're actually dynamically rendering the children. Maybe the children are coming from some other context in some way. We'll see an example of that in a second. But this is actually a representation of the navigation and navigation pill item thing, except it just has a little bit more nuance to it. It allows us to think in terms of like, dear engineer, you're getting used to our design system. You're learning a whole bunch of new things. Here's how we think about rendering navigation components like this. This is also going to be very similar. We're using the same navigation in code. It's the same navigation component, but we have a different button inside of it. And these buttons can have icon props and all of these other things. Now, that's one way to think about the React code for this navigation component, but here's another very common one. Mobile navigation, no props, bare, you just dump it at the bottom of your thing, right? This is another type. This is like a vanity component where you have encapsulated this idea of your site-wide mobile navigation or what have you as a single component. It doesn't need any props, but you do need to dump it in a few different places. So you can also document it in that way. But we still have the ability to kind of like come in and look at, oh, this is the selected one, and here's how I'd render a selected item in that list. So depending on what level of visibility you need, how much granularity you need, you have the ability to kind of like document all these things in different ways. And it has, some really it allows you to think of your developers as users of what you're doing. And you're able to kind of like document that stuff in code. Now, The third way that we can think about a navigation component, same navigation component, is explicitly with the compose children. And an example of this, composed is what we say when we're talking about actually writing everything out. So here we go. This is a really small component that we're using just for a monthly annual toggle of some kind. And so you have the ability to kind of just like do that too. Now, we're going to zoom out one level back, and we're going to take a peek at this component. So this is an example of some of that stuff we were just talking about, except instead of an arbitrary array, we're actually using a React context to go out and get our monthly options for pricing. So something developers are having to deal with is like, well, we want a pricing page. Well, where do those numbers come from? Where does knowing what currency it is come from? Where does knowing what plan someone's already on come from? You have all of these like dynamic aspects to what you're thinking about when you're trying to document something that's as relatively simple as like some pricing cards in a big old section. So this is an example of how you'd grab those monthly options from a pricing context, and then you'd spread them out, or you'd map them down here, and then spread out those props on an instance of the pricing card like this. But also keep in mind, like, we still have the ability to just click on the pricing card and look at that as a vanity component that has everything being passed in as a prop. So we can look at it in those terms. But then if we want to see what's under the vanity component, we have the ability to kind of like keep going further and look at, okay, there's a text list, and this is exactly what it looks like. And here's our text price component, because oftentimes these sorts of things are abstracted in some way to allow you to render many different types. You know, sometimes the currency is at the end instead of the beginning, and like all that sort of a thing. And oftentimes that's informed by some user data. Where's the user coming from? If they're coming from one place, we're going to render this differently. So we need to kind of like capture all of those sorts of things in different ways than designers might be thinking about it. But this kind of goes to show you how we have this ability to like look at this stuff in many different ways, right? We're looking at a lot of the same components, but from different perspectives, because your engineers are going to have different perspectives depending on the task that they're being asked to kind of accomplish. And some of this is really good as general documentation, but then some of it's also really good as this is the copy-paste code that I need. One other example here, a lot of folks do a pattern like this where they have a React hook that is informing like the device size or some other information that's going to influence what the props values are. So like we have a section component and a flex component, and we're passing those values in here. Gap is gap, and what gap is if we're on mobile, it's small, and if we're not, it's medium, right? You also have little things like direction, right? We're going from a column layout to a row layout for this flex item right down here. So lots of different things in there, right? But what I'm so excited about for Code Connect is that we have this kind of like ability to kind of give our developers what we need, and the best person who's going to really solve this for you is the person that kind of understands enough of what's happening in design and is working closely enough with your design systems team to understand kind of how the designer experience is being considered in your design system, but then also has an understanding of how to think about this in code. Because it's really important that you don't want to over-optimize in one direction over another, because you can really make things really unusable for someone else. You can make the design systems patterns in your design file unusable for your design team by over-indexing on a bunch of developer concerns. So Code Connect is great because it allows you to kind of keep the peace a little bit and allow you to optimize independently where it's a good idea, you know, because it's not always a good idea. All right, two other things before we get going. One, we have a script. So like a lot of you, one of the biggest kind of sets of components that exist in your design files and your code bases is icons. And we have in the Code Connect repository, we have a wonderful little script that helps you publish Code Connect docs for large sets of icons. In the SDS, Simple Design System code base, I've also written some scripts for us that generate the React components as well for all of your icons, in addition to the Code Connect docs. And it gives you some examples to kind of get going about how our extensibility platform, which is, by the way, amazing. Shout out extensibility team. Yeah, I got a whoop over there somewhere. So there's lots of different things that you can do when you're thinking at scale and you're trying to document your stuff, like extensibility. It's amazing. We have great REST APIs in the SDS code base. In addition to building a variables sync, where it syncs through the W3C token spec to CSS from Figma variables, we also built some plugins. So if you don't have access to that REST API, you can run a private plugin and get access to similar data. So there's a whole bunch of resources there, which I encourage you to check out. I wish I had water right now. OK, can we switch back to the slides as we exit here? Oh, we do have water? Oh my
God.
goodness.
It's been here the whole time.
Both of us are going to go.
All right.
Water. All right. ABH, always be hydrating. This is a Catalina wine mixer now. OK, so we're out of beta. That's the big thing here. Code Connect is finally out of beta, which is worth celebrating. DevTools team, you've been so hard at work, and it's really, really cool where we're at. If you have feedback, issues on GitHub are going to be the best place to go. We plan to support, right now, we currently support React, React Native, Swift UI, Jetpack Compose, but we have plans to support a whole lot more, including Vue, Web Components, Angular, et cetera, as well as allowing you to kind of like hopefully build your own sophisticated implementation if you have something very specific. But the community's already been super, just fantastic feedback. Upvote all the things you want because we're listening and watching every day. And then also, simple design system plug. I built this code base. Louis built the design system. It was a close collaboration between the two of us. React, it's built on React Aria, which is an awesome resource to kind of ensure an accessible layer underneath. But it's kind of, the way we're thinking about it is the best example of what a lot of our customers have to deal with. You have big libraries that are meant to be used by tons of different people. But a lot of our customers know exactly what they want. So they don't need a million permutations of different components. They just need the one that they need, right? So we wanted to start demonstrating some of those things because oftentimes the design to developer handoff can look a little bit different depending on like what you're building for yourself. So yeah, check out this, github.com/figma/SDS. OK.
You want a break?
Yeah, do you want to take the rest of these?
Yeah, sure. You've been talking a lot. The other thing I'll mention about SDS is that you can get the Figma file if this isn't already obvious on Figma community.
Oh, yeah.
So
Figma file.
I find one thing that's really helpful for me to get started is to say, look at all of the components and how they're structured in a Figma file, and then go look at the Code Connect docs that are already in SDS. Also, one of the biggest pieces of feedback we already got yesterday from tons of people is like, thank you, I can show my developers what we want to have happen, like with Code Connect. Like, it's a really great resource to kind of give your developers an idea of what's possible. So all the UI kits, whether you're doing native or web, it's a great example there, too. So in short, we really hope this is going to help you increase design systems adoption, especially with engineers throughout your organization. And one thing that I think, I guess the picture that I would like to tell is that like you could be in VS Code, accessing dev mode from a side panel, and seeing the code snippets from your design system while you're inspecting components. And that component code is reliable, and it's the component code that you need to use. And so being able to do that is not only going to like solve that toggle tax of switching between different tools that we talked about earlier, but just also helpful for developers to do what they love doing most, which is writing code and being quick at it. And then this gives you the ability, I think, just to improve the collaboration between teams, because I can't tell you how many times I've seen, you used the hover state example earlier, and you get into these situations where sometimes the code focus of your approach leaks into the design library. So they're like, well, let's not create variants for like hover and active states because we don't have to specify them in code. But then all of a sudden you want to build a prototype and you want to use an interactive component that has a hover state. You don't have a destination on the canvas to sort of like create a little noodle between your default state and your hover state to create those sorts of interactions. So that's one of those like deltas between design and code that I think Code Connect can really help you solve. One of the things that we're thinking about in the future is additional support for more frameworks. And I don't want to I don't think we have a timeline on this, but we're also thinking about the ability for people to like be able to extend this if we're not able to get to all of those frameworks ourselves. And then, of course, we're working on faster setup efficiencies in our command line tools as well. And one thing that I know you and I have been talking about a lot is that when we launched Dev Mode last year, Dev Mode has its own code gen API. So if you wanted to build a plugin that generates code, you can do that. One of the common use cases for developing your own code was exactly the problem that Code Connect solves. But then you have all of these other constructs, like what about an entire screen? And so if you could build a plugin that has access to your Code Connect snippets, then you could iterate through an entire screen and literally translate like frames with auto layout with your component code in them and give you a great starting point on much more than what you're seeing today at a component by component level.
Do you want to take that?
Well,
thank you for joining us today. Now it's time to Code Connect.
Thank you.